This next stage is one of the ones that I used to hate the most when I first started violin making, and now it's one of those that I love the most. And I'm of course talking about the purfling. Now the reason why I used to hate this stage so much is because when you first start in violin making, you don't really see a lot of the mistakes that you're doing. You just don't really have the eye trained to see when you mess up, to see the things you're doing wrong. But that's not really the case with the purfling, because the purfling is basically made out of 2 strips of black pieces of wood, 1 piece of white wood, and I use like a magnifying lens as well to see that, to see the corners, and if those lines don't match, they don't match. They are not aligned, they're not aligned, which means that I could see those mistakes even when my eyes were not trained enough to call myself a proper violin maker, let's say. So I used to get very frustrated. I used to get the pieces of the purfling, I used to break them, throw them on the floor, try to start all over again. And at some point, I guess I just learned how to do it, and now I really enjoy it. Another thing that happens is that even when you actually manage to make them fit at the beginning, and then you think that you learned because they fit, then over time you start realizing that just by changing a little bit the way you cut into those corners, the angles that you give to the knife and everything, you're also going to be changing a little bit the shape of that curve, slightly of course, and that slight change is going to make a very big difference on aesthetics and the design of those curves. So even when you think that you learned, then you realize that you didn't actually learn, you just learned how to make them fit, but you didn't learn how to make them fit nicely. So once again, these are things that are actually quite visible even for someone who didn't manage to train so much, to have such a trained eye into details. So yeah, I used to really hate it. But as I said, now I really enjoy it, so I'm going to be working on that this time. Although there is a slight, not change of plans, but let's say a slight difference to the thing that I was saying, which is trying to make it aesthetically pleasing and all. And it is that this one is going to be an antique looking instrument, and I want these corners to look more or less similar to the ones of the original instrument. I don't want to say exactly like the one of the original instrument, because some of them are a bit too messed up and I don't really want to replicate that. Some of them are incredibly short, and I also don't want to do that in this case in particular. And also because I designed this cello model, I didn't take it in particular from one of the Filius Andreae models, so there is not really one exact corner that I can copy. They are quite similar. I took this model is of course inspired by others, and I could take one as a main reference, but it's not exactly the same. This is inspired by that. It is a model based on other models, but the design is kind of mine, so it would be impossible to replicate that. So with that said, I just wanted to add that I've realized that I forgot to show in the previous video that I was scraping the area where the fluting is here for the channel for the purfling, and I did that off camera because I felt I already filmed and tortured you with 4 hours of video in the previous one, so I didn't want to add more suffering to those viewers that actually watched even part of that. So with all this said, let's begin working on the purfling. So before I start working on the purfling, I need to get the purfling itself. So I have here these strips of wood which I glued before, and I'm going to be cutting them out. I think I have in total 4 PURFLING markers, 2 for violin and viola and 2 for cello. So basically I have 2 of them, 1 for each type, that I use if I'm going to be making modern looking instruments, and I have other 2 that I use if I want to make antique looking instruments. As once again, for the antique ones, I do want to have some, let's say, imperfections, or perfect imperfections if you want to make it sound nicely. And now comes a very interesting part of bending the purfling. But before that, there is something else that I need to do, and that is to make sure that the purfling fits inside the channel. Now, as I mentioned, this purfling, did I mention it? Okay, if I didn't mention it, this purfling is handmade, which usually gives a very nice effect, at least in my opinion. It makes it quite unique. It really gives a very nice effect, as I was saying, on the final result. But it also means that there are some irregularities. Then I also mentioned that I was using a particular purfling channel cutter for this model, for this instrument, because I want to make it antique looking, so I wanted to have that old style on the purfling. That's the same reason as well of why this handmade purfling looks so nice, in particular on the antique instruments. But we have a handmade purfling which usually has some irregularities. We have a purfling channel which usually has some irregularities, or at least for the antique with this purfling cutter it gives some irregularities which I want. But irregularities plus irregularities means that most likely the purfling, these guys, the strips, will not fit inside everywhere perfectly. So then there are a couple of things that I can do. One is of course to enlarge the channel, and the other one is to try to remove a little bit more wood on the purfling where the part that doesn't fit, to make it fit. I can also try squeezing it, usually with just like the round part of the gouges of the chisel. I can just make some pressure to make it squeeze, which then with hot glue will also expand a little bit. Anyway, there are a lot of things to do. I'm probably not going to be filming much of them because it can be quite tedious in a way, because it's just checking, making sure what it doesn't fit, removing, checking again. And as again, like I have a bit of regularities both on the purfling and on the purfling channel, it's not like I can just make it fit somewhere and then that part will fit everywhere. If not that, in this case, and that's very different to when making a modern purfling where the purfling fits everywhere the same. Here it's kind of a bit more specific to each part. So if I'm making the curve for the lower bout, then I need to make sure that this piece of wood corresponds to the lower bout of the back, for example. So yeah, it feels like it was a very long explanation for this thing that I'm going to be doing. I don't know why I explained so much, because it's, I guess, quite obvious in a way. But let's start working on this. I actually really enjoy doing this part. I like seeing the pieces come together. So for example, I have this piece here that doesn't fit in this channel. Just by a little bit, I can see that it's just a little bit. In some areas it fits, like here. So I'm quite sure that in this case, just by pressing it with this tool, for example, as I was saying, I can also use the back of a gouge, it is going to end up fitting. And if it doesn't, it's going to be an amazing blooper. It doesn't fit everywhere, but almost everywhere. It's hard to tell actually. It's hard to show, sorry. It's actually easy to tell from my perspective. Like here it's fitting everywhere. Same here. It says here at the top. And if I look at it, I can see that it's much thicker, the purfling here at the top, so in that case I need to be removing a little bit. I think that's it, because it seems like it was just bigger on one side only. And here it is now already fitting. Once again, it's difficult to show because with all the curves and having here the angle, I cannot put it fully inside. Okay, I'm ready to glue the PURFLING. Usually the way that I glue the PURFLING when I'm working on an antique and a modern instrument is quite different. For the modern ones, as a channels are regular and everything, I just use a stick, put some glue, hammer everything, and that's it. For the antique ones instead, I prefer using the syringe, just because syringe, I can remember the right pronunciation, just because being everything irregular, I just want to make sure that everything is going to be fitting first. So yeah, I think the glue is ready and I can start. Realize now that I forgot to cut this. The purfling is glued, so now the next step is to remove the extra purfling actually. The one that is on top of the channel that I made before. But this being an antique, sometimes I don't like fully removing the whole purfling until I reach to the same level of the channel. If not, that I maybe in some parts like leaving a little bit more of the purfling on top, as I then like to squeeze it deeper inside, which is an effect that you can see on some old instruments that happened when they used to get like glued and unglued and closed with the clamps. In some cases the purfling came out and they had to re-glue it again, sometimes the purfling is squeezed, etc, etc, etc. This of course doesn't mean that I'm going to leave like an extra centimeter on top of the channel, not even 1 millimeter, if not like a tiny bit. And maybe it's not even like a rule that I'm going to be following. In some parts I will definitely get to the same level of the channel, in some parts I might leave that extra tiny bit. It is not something that I can really explain, it's not something that I just see while I'm working on it, how it might look, what I might think that I might be able to do later. So it's really something that comes from kind of experience and the training of the eye. So for this I'm going to be using the same gouges that I used before when doing the fluting, and that's it. So I will start working on that. Now it has warmed up some water that I'm going to be using to clean the extra glue that's left over around here. So okay, the purfling is done, and now the thing that is left for me to do is to do some more finishing, in particular on the fluting around the purfling, on the purfling itself as well in some parts, and then to do the finishing of the archings. I'm going to be doing that with the scrapers, and then for those who know already from other videos, you know that I like doing the finishing of my instruments using horsetail. So I am going to be doing that. I don't really know if I'm going to be putting that in this video or if I'm going to be doing it in another one that we'll probably call the finishing. I know, very original as a name. And I also need to do the rounding of the edges. I usually like doing that at this stage. Same thing, I'm not really sure if I'm going to be putting that in this video or if I'm going to be putting that in another one. I guess that if this is the end of the video, then I decided to do it later, and if you keep seeing some of the stuff, that means that I decided to do it now. It's just a bit strange because this episode, or however you want to call it, it's probably going to be named the PURFLING, which means that putting the finishing of the arching and the rounding of the edges here feels like kind of out of place, but at the same time I'm doing it now, so it kind of feels right. You can let me know in the comments what you think the right decision would have been. Very controversial, I know, like a matter of life and death. Anyway, jokes aside, those are the things that I have to do now, and yeah, we'll see how this video finishes.